Everybody got quiet, so I guess it's time to get started. I'd like to welcome everyone here this morning. Before we dismiss for Bible class, we'll sing number 251. Number 251, I am happy today. I'm happy today, oh yes, I'm happy today. In Jesus Christ, I'm happy today, because He's taken all my sins away, and that's why I'm happy today. I'm singing today, oh yes, I'm singing today. In Jesus Christ I'm singing today, because He's taken all my sins away, and that's why I'm singing today. I'm praying today, oh yes, I'm praying today. In Jesus Christ I'm praying today, because He's taken all my sins away, and that's why I'm praying today. I'm living today, oh yes, I'm living today. In Jesus Christ I'm living today, because He's taken all my sins away, and that's why I'm living today. I'm happy today, oh yes, I'm singing today. In Jesus Christ I'm praying today, because He's taken all my sins away, and that's why I'm living today. Now we let the word of prayer.
Let's pray. Holy Father, so very grateful for this morning, for the time that we can set aside to be able to come and to be able to stand before you, to be able to open the bread of life together, that we might be able to study the Bible, that we might be able to make those applications and those changes in our lives that would draw us closer to you. We ask you to be with the teachers at this time, that they be mindful of those things that they have studied. Help us as listeners to be mindful of the efforts that they have put in, for the importance of these things to our life, that we would take these things seriously and apply them in every way possible. We thank you most of all for Christ and for the great love that He's shown us. Help us never forget that. All this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Good morning.
You have a workbook? You have a worksheet? You have a workbook? If your interest is the same, I know that you've been looking on. Mark chapter 1. If you were to pick up the New Testament for the first time and begin reading in Matthew and read through the Gospel of John, a natural question would be, why are there 4 accounts of the life of Jesus? And that's what we're looking at, I think, in our beginning studies, is the purpose of each one of the Gospels. We talked about that Matthew, in our first lesson that Matthew was a gospel that was written to the Jews to affirm that Jesus was the Messiah. And the technique that Matthew used was to show that Jesus was fulfillment of so many of those Old Testament prophecies. Mark begins his gospel with the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Now, the author of this particular gospel is also a matter of tradition and established by the writings of the second and third century writers that they found the manuscripts of, and most of those writers referred to the gospel as being written by Mark. This is John Mark, and we're introduced to Mark at first in the book of Acts. We learn about his mother, first of all. John's mother's named Mary, and it was at her house that the church was assembled praying after Peter had been arrested by Herod. He had killed James, and now he had Peter in prison, and then, of course, the angel helps Peter get out. And in in Mark, the early chapter, it says that he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John Mark. So we were introduced to him early then, and then later on in that book, later on in the book of Acts, we read about his association with Barnabas and also with Paul. So this indicates, I think when we look at that Mark had a close association with the church at Jerusalem. Many of the writers believe that he was probably one of the early converts soon after Pentecost or soon after Pentecost when the church was established. He was the cousin of Barnabas. We read that in Colossians chapter 4, Mark chapter 4 and verse 10, when Paul writes from Rome while he's in prison, and he closes his epistle with Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, greets you with Mark, the cousin of Barnabas, about whom you've received instructions. So we read about Mark early on. Paul makes reference to Mark being the cousin of Barnabas. And of course it was the disagreement, if you will, about Mark that kind of divided Paul and Barnabas in their missionary work. In Acts chapter 12, look at verse 25. Acts 12, verse 25 says, And Barnabas and Saul returned from Jerusalem when they had fulfilled the ministry. Then they took with them John, whose surname was Mark. This was after the discussion, after they returned and taken the gifts to Jerusalem. And when they left there to go back to Antioch, they bring Mark with them. And then in chapter 13, after they leave for the second missionary journey, in chapter 13 of Acts, it says, when Paul and his party set sail from Pampus, the Perga to Pamphylia, and John was with them from then on after he had returned from Jerusalem. But then in chapter 15, we read about the dispute, between Barnabas and Paul over Mark. And this is chapter 15, beginning at verse 37. It says, Now Barnabas was determined to take with him John Mark. Paul insisted they should not take him with him. The one who had departed from them in Pamphylia had not gone with them to do the work. Then the contention became so sharp that they parted from one another. Barnabas took Mark and sailed to Cyprus, and Paul chose Silas and departed, being commended by the brethren to the grace of God. So it was over this discussion with Mark and the fact that he left early and went back to Jerusalem before they had completed their work on that first missionary journey. But later on, it's obvious that Paul and Mark, if they were at odds with one another, were reconciled. And there's really no evidence that Paul was mad at Mark. He just didn't feel like that he should go with him. But later on in Timothy, when he wrote to Timothy, he mentions that Mark is useful for him when he instructs Timothy to come to him. So, and then in Colossians chapter 4 again, even in Rome, I think this is an interesting part here, Even in Rome, Mark is there with Paul. And that might be some evidence to the fact of the purpose of the writing. Mark was introduced to the church there at Rome early on when Paul was in prison there. The time of the book, that the book was written, is sometime between the latter 50s and 70 AD. And the purpose of the book, where Matthew was written to confirm Jesus was the Messiah, Mark's purpose is different. I think that beginning statement, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, he identifies Jesus as the Christ, and he identifies Jesus as the Son of God. Mark already believes that Jesus was the Messiah. He also believes that he was the Son of God. So he doesn't lay out arguments and proofs in regards to who Jesus was, but what he does in his writing is to emphasize the character and the person and the power of Jesus. He emphasized the parts of his life that demonstrate Jesus' power and his righteous living. And it's from this interior evidence that it's clear that Mark is writing specifically to Gentiles. And that's the exercises that we had on our worksheet are just, an exercise showing the interior evidence that Mark's intent was to write to Gentiles about the life of Christ. And one of he explains in his writing several Jewish customs. Now, Matthew wouldn't have to do that because he's writing to the Jews. And in our exercises, you see, there are some things that Mark adds to account that Matthew also records, but Mark adds to those some things that would help the Gentiles to understand that. Let's look at those questions on the workbook, those comparisons. Let's begin. Kenny, would you read Matthew chapter 15, verses 1 and 2?
Then the scribes and Pharisees who were from Jerusalem came to Jesus, saying, "Why do your disciples transgress the tradition of the elders? They do not wash their hands when they eat bread."
Okay, here's Matthew's account of the conflict or the challenge, if you will, that the Pharisees bring against Christ to his apostles. Now, in Mark chapter 7, Mark also records this, but then what does Mark add to this account?
One thing that he mentions is they wash their hands in a special way, not just wash their hands, and then goes on to add that they hold to washing cups, pitchers, copper vessels, and couch. They cleanse a lot more than just their hands.
Okay, all right. Anyone else? What about that verse 3? Somebody read verse 3 and 4 of Mark 7. Albert, would you read that for us? Mark 7, verse 3 and 4.
For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they wash their hands in a special way, holding the tradition of the elders. When they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash. And there are many other things which they have received and hold, like the washing of cups, pitchers, copper vessels, and couches.
Okay, so he lays out the tradition. Yeah, James?
Mine says in a ceremonial way.
In a ceremonial way, unless they wash their hands in a special or a ceremonial way. Okay? So he goes to great length to explain the reason that they challenged Jesus. I think that's it. He said, notice the wording, and the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat. Now, that particular phrase shows us that his audience are not Jews. His main audience are not Jews. So, and then of course the explanation within the rest of that text. Okay, Matthew chapter 24. Ken, would you read verse 3? Matthew chapter 24, verse 3.
Now as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the signs of your coming and of the end of the age?"
Okay, now, Here's the account of the apostles asking Jesus in regards to the coming of the kingdom. What does Mark add to his account of that event?
The names of the apostles that were with them.
Okay, well, I didn't notice that, but that is right. Anyone else? I'm sorry?
It's opposite the temple.
Okay, all right, let's read Mark chapter 13, verse 3. Billy Smith, do you mind reading that, please?
Mark 13.
Mark 13, 3.
Now they sat on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple. Peter, James, John, and Andrew asked him, Rabbi.
Okay, so here's the account. Two things are different. He names the disciples, but then he names where they're sitting. He said, Matthew says, they sat on Mount Olives, and he gives the location of Mount Olives, and well, it's opposite of where the temple is. So again, you know, if he's writing to the Jews, he wouldn't have to make that particular explanation. They would know where Mount Olives was in their understanding of the city of Jerusalem. Okay, Matthew chapter 26. Kim, would you read verse 17? Verse 17.
Now on the first day of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus and asked, "Where do you want us to prepare for you to eat the Passover?"
Okay. I was looking at Kyle and I said Kim. I'm really in trouble. We're going to have to wear name tags from now on your forehead. I'm just saying. Okay. Now, this is the Feast of the Unleavened Bread. It's the instruction that Jesus gave to his disciples, apostles, in regards to the preparation for the Passover. What does Mark add to that particular event?
It's also when they sacrificed the Passover lamb.
Okay, he explains what the preparation day was. Look at Mark chapter 14. Let's read verse 12. Would you do that for us, Andy?
And on the first day of unleavened bread, when they sacrificed the Passover lamb, his disciples said to him, Where will you have us go and prepare for you to eat the Passover?
Okay, just another explanation for those that he's writing to. The Jews would have known this. Matthew's account, writing to the Jews, doesn't include this because they would have understood exactly what that date incurred. Okay, Mark chapter, the next one, 15, and Matthew chapter 27. Okay, Kyle, if you will. Matthew chapter 27, verse 62.
The next day, that is, after the day of preparation, the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered before Pilate.
Okay, now in Mark 15, what does he add to that particular account?
The day before the Sabbath.
The day before the Sabbath. In verse 42 of Mark chapter 15. Marshall, would you read that verse for us, 15:42?
Now, when evening had come, because it was the preparation day, that is, the day before the Sabbath.
Okay, preparation day, the day before the Sabbath. So he just adds information. Now, what the author of our workbook does for us there, he demonstrates how you look at the interior evidence in the writings that are inspired to us. You know, when we think about Bible study, there's so much involved in our Bible study. Sometimes we really we don't look carefully enough at many of the things that we study. And it's always important that when we study a text on a particular subject, that we compare every text in regards to that subject so that we get the full account, we get the full message that God wants us to have. And so when we study things like the Gospels, and we're going to look Matthew and Mark, Luke and John, each of those Gospels, the evidence in the Gospels themselves, especially Matthew, Mark, and John, those Gospels are not autographed. Now, Luke tells us who's writing that particular one. So how do you figure out who the author was? Well, they look at the interior evidence that's in the writing itself, and that really helps us to understand, in this particular case, the purpose of the book itself. Writing to Gentiles in regards to the life of Christ. And we see that those differences in those accounts. But another evidence that we see is Mark also translates several Aramaic expressions. And that's a language that the Jews, the Hebrew-speaking Jews would have understood. But then the Latin-speaking Gentiles, the Romans, wouldn't be familiar with. Let's look at a couple of examples of that. Mark chapter 5, verse 41. Scott, would you read that for us? Mark 5, verse 41.
Taking her by the hand, he said to her, to Leokumith, which means little girl, I say to you, arise. So he takes that one phrase and then he translates what that Aramaic phrase would be so the readers would understand that. Another example in chapter 7 in verse 11. Garrett, would you read that for us? Chapter 7, verse 11. Mark, yeah. We're not moving out of that very much now. So.
But you say, if an ancestor's father or mother, whatever profit you might have received from me is for them. That is a gift to God.
So again, he defines that term Corban so that his readers would understand that. And then one final example of that, chapter 15, verse 22. Eric, would you read that?
15 and 22?
Yeah.
They brought into the place Golgotha, which is translated place of a skull.
Okay, so he makes these translations. This is just another example of the fact that he's writing to a specific group of people that might not understand these terms, that Matthew might use, if you will, in his writings. One more example of that in chapter 12, where he translates Greek into Latin. In chapter 12, verse 42. Where we at? Billy Russell, would you read that for us, please?
What was the verse again? Mark what?
42, 12:42.
Mark 12:42. The one poor widow came and threw in 2 mites, which might make quadrants.
Which makes a quadrant.
Which makes a quadrant.
Yes, okay. So there we go. Again, just simple translations. Little phrases a lot of times that we would look over, but if we're trying to determine the purpose of the book and to whom Mark is writing, these little phrases are very helpful in seeing exactly or comparing, the difference between Matthew's writing and Mark's as well. So Mark's writing to the Romans, evidenced by the language that he defines and that he translates. But also in the fact that Mark emphasizes the authority of Jesus, his power, his patience, his endurance, and all of those qualities were considered virtue by the Romans. So these are things that he would bring out in the life of Christ and his teaching. He doesn't do a lot of teaching. If you notice the difference in Matthew and Mark, Matthew deals a lot with the teaching. John deals a lot with Jesus' teaching. Mark more in the events in Christ's life. He doesn't have but one example of any in-depth teaching that Jesus made. He makes a peculiar statement. Look at Mark chapter 10. And this is another evidence that he's writing to Romans specifically. Mark chapter 10, we're going to leave 11 and 12. Joe, can you read that for us? Mark 10, verse 11 and 12.
So he said to them, whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. And if a woman divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery.
Okay. In this particular, he makes a statement down there, if a woman divorces her husband and marries another. Now, Matthew's account of that talks about the husband divorcing the wife. And Mark, he specifically talks about the wife divorcing the husband. Now, what's unusual about this, and what I think stands out as evidence, is that under the law of Moses, a woman couldn't divorce her husband. But under Roman law, a woman could divorce her husband. So, if he's writing to the Jews, he's not going to mention. Matthew doesn't mention the opposite end of the divorce question. But Mark includes that one particular statement, and it really kind of stands out when you compare it to Matthew chapter 19 in Jesus' discussion on divorce and remarriage. So this arrangement in verse 12 it's not found in the other gospel. It's just another hint that he's writing to a particular group of people and explaining to them the life of Christ, if you will. Mark closes his gospel with a succession of events that are important to the gospel message and to Mark's purpose. But these statements in this part of the chapter is held in question. I think the author of our workbook spends a great deal of time explaining why we should include these scriptures in the Gospel of Mark. That is Mark chapter 16, the last few verses of that particular chapter, beginning about verse 9. If you read any of the information in the workbook, you see he talks a little bit about why this is challenged by some and not by others, and then why it's included in the New Testament that we have today. It has to do with the age of the manuscripts that were used in translating this particular book. Some of the old translations, some of the older manuscripts didn't have these verses in it, but then he says some other manuscripts that were just as old as it does have this in it. I've got some study material at home that written by the Catholics, and the Catholics challenge the validity of these verses as far as the New Testament is concerned. In Mark chapter 16, let's begin at verse 9, and let's read through the end of the chapter. It said, now when he arose early on the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, out of whom he cast 7 demons. He went and told those who had been with him as they mourned and wept. And when they heard him, he was alive and had been seen by her, they did not believe. After that, he appeared in another form to 2 of them as they walked and went into the country. And they went and told to the rest, but they did not believe them either. Later, he appeared to the 11 and sat at the table and rebuked their unbelief and hardness of heart, because they did not believe those who had seen him after he had risen. And he said to them, go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. He who believes and is baptized will be saved, but he who does not believe will be condemned. And these signs will follow those who believe. In my name they will cast out demons. They will speak with new tongues. They will take up serpents, and if they drink anything deadly, it will by no means hurt them. They will lay hands on the sick, and they will recover. So then after the Lord had spoken to them, he was received up into heaven and sat down at the right hand of God. And they went on and preached everywhere, the Lord working with them and confirming the word through the accompanying signs. So in these final verses, we have the account of the resurrection, the appearance of Jesus to Mary Magdalene, and then to the 2 men that were traveling, as we learned later on, to the little city south of Jerusalem, to Emmaus, and appears to them, and they go and tell the apostles, and the apostles don't believe them. And then Jesus appears to them and rebukes them. And rebukes them, obviously, because they were unwilling to accept testimony that he's fixing to commission them to do. He's going to take them as eyewitnesses of his resurrection, take that gospel to people who haven't seen. And he said, you haven't accepted that kind of testimony. These people saw me, and they came and told you, and you didn't believe. How are you going to be able to go and tell somebody and convince them that the truth of my resurrection? So he gives them the commission to go into all the world and preach the gospel, his ascension, and then the execution of the execution of that commission that he gives to him, and the confirmation that God works to prove the gospel to be true through the signs that were given. Now, it's interesting to me, why would people challenge the validity of these last verses, aside from the fact they weren't in the manuscripts? Is there anything within those verses that you would see that would be kind of controversial, that people might not want to hear in the first place?
Verse 16, for sure.
Well, yeah, there we go. That's the first thing that popped to mind, is the commission and the instructions in regard to what subject? Baptism. I mean, it's always, people always look for an excuse to get out of getting into water. Somebody called that hydrophobia. I'm not sure what that is. But that's what other things in there do you think that might be challenged by other people in the world? What about the resurrection? There's a lot of people that doubt that Jesus was raised from the dead today. Most certainly there's a lot of people that do that. And then his appearances. The significance of his appearances, I believe, is really significant in our responsibility and our acceptance of the gospel. Because what Jesus does with the apostles when he sends Mary Magdalene and when the two men that were on their way to Emmaus, thank you very much, on the road to Emmaus, when they don't believe their testimony and Jesus, I think that's pretty significant, because what that does for us, it really kind of confirms the validity of the Gospels, if you will. These men's account of the life of Christ. These would be, aside from Luke, they were witnesses of the resurrected Christ. And their accounts are their testimony in regards to that truth. So it's important that we understand that Jesus rebuked them because they didn't do what so many people today don't do, and that is believe the testimony, the evidence of testimony, if you will, and the importance of that kind of evidence. So also the commission, and then the ascension. The ascension would be important to the Romans because it establishes the authority of Christ. It should be important to us because, Luke includes this in his gospel. Jesus ascended, sat down at the right hand of God, and rules. He has authority. And those things are important for us to understand. Any other thoughts then about these last few verses and their importance? Yes, Ken?
Do you know what the Catholics, what their argument against this is?
Evidently, it's the manuscript argument.
Okay.
Because, in your worksheet, he talks about the difference of those two manuscripts and the reason that some of the people reject it. And their argument would be the manuscript. Yeah. Yes, sir.
I don't want to sound negative or that I don't believe what we believe, because I believe it, if that means anything. But there are so few fragments of the writing of the New Testament in the first and second century, and they don't really begin lots of details until the 3rd, 4th, and 5th century. Not everybody had following Jesus around a big cheap tablet writing down what he said, because most of them were ignorant of writing and reading and things of that nature. And a lot of things were still in progress were the way done was oral traditions. Matthew and Mark particularly, you mentioned them being witnesses to what Jesus said, may only be recounting what they witnessed, not what everybody, And Mark and Luke will go into a lot of detail because he researches more people, what they saw, what they heard, and what he saw.
Yeah.
Whereas Matthew and Mark simply are recounting what they saw and how it is important to them as they focus on. I'm not saying Matthew didn't write Matthew and Mark didn't write Mark, but the likelihood of it being that way is probably carried a little bit further down orally. I don't particularly disagree with anything this man says, except he's a scholar, and it's important to have everything laid out so people will buy the material and believe that he knows what he's talking about. I'm sorry to sound negative.
Well, there is written evidence that by writers in the 2nd century, the church fathers, and I think there's about 6 of those men, that their writings are, those things are available. The manuscripts of those writings. I don't know how old.
Well, not of Mark 16:16.
I'm sorry?
Not of Mark 16:16. It goes to the 3rd and 4th century before that is included in any manuscripts. The 2nd century doesn't. Any of the fragments, and we don't have any complete fragments of hardly anything in the 1st and 2nd, or books hardly in the 1st and 2nd century. Most of the completions of what we have are in 3rd and 4th and 5th century. That doesn't take away from the inspiration of God, and it doesn't take away the fact that they're biblically sound, and particularly Mark 16:60, biblically sound. Yeah. It's just the fact that there is a reason for these people to contradict it because they want a reason to contradict it.
Well, and that's true. I agree with that statement absolutely. I think that probably there is evidence that the New Testament, in a complete form, aside from the book of Revelations, was being circulated in the 1st century. There's evidence in regards to that. F.F. Brooks is very clear on that.
I don't think so.
Well, I'll give you F.F. Brooks' book, and you can look at it and whatever.
I understand. I've been through the scholarly world.
Yeah, I'm going to tell you, I graduated from high school. That's as far as I've gone.
Well,
I don't even want to go
making light of that. I'm just saying I'm familiar with a lot of the scholarly.
I get what you're saying. And the material that we have, when he bases arguments in regards to ancient manuscripts, those things, those are controversial areas, but he lays out facts. He's got some facts. The transcripts that he refers to are in fact extant.
1st century, 2nd century?
No, he doesn't say anything about the 1st century.
Well, I understand that. I understand what you're saying. But I'm just saying that complete manuscripts and complete thought of the New Testament doesn't come in full form until the 3rd, 4th, 5th century. And I'm not saying all of it.
So what you're trying to tell us, Nick, is that in the 2nd century, most of it was oral tradition?
Well, I'm saying to begin with, most of it was oral tradition. And as the 2nd century come, more of it started being compiled and written.
I'm not real sure that I could agree with that completely, because Paul, when he writes to the church at Thessalonica, he instructs them to read this letter and let the church up north of it read it as well. They pass those things around.
The Apostle Paul, in a very different situation, he has had education in the temple, not only in the temple, but his education. He goes into detail about who he is and how much form he has. Jesus is educated in the temple, but a lot of these people, like the Galileans, they're not educated. They don't have that.
I have to disagree with that, because Jewish law, it made the parents responsible. They were all homeschooled. I'm just telling you how that is. Now, if you disagree with homeschooling, that'd be your opinion as well.
How do you homeschool when you don't have an education yourself?
Well, they had the Bible. Now, that's all they need. They had the Old Testament.
They didn't have the Septuagint in every corner of the house.
I don't know. I'm not going to argue pro or con on that one now, but I know that the Hebrews taught their children the law. So how far else do you
How did they teach it orally? They taught it orally because of what they heard.
They had a whole lot better memories back then than we had.
Yes, they do. We have iPhones and we I mean, that's how they had to communicate, was orally. They
Yeah.
didn't have the kind of, they didn't have what we had. And a lot of my objections to the things that we read in other people's writings is they take a focus on how we are, how they are. They don't think about what is back early, and they just didn't have it. And I am not a doubter of the Bible.
Well, I understand that.
I just kind of doubt some of the things that are written.
Okay. Well, we kind of got off track. Let's go over our final questions really quick. Where are these events recorded? These are the that I sent online, if you've got those. Where is the baptism of Jesus recorded in the book of Mark?
1:9.
Where's the teaching on marriage, divorce, and remarriage in the book of Mark?
10:6-12.
Speak up.
10:6-12.
Okay. Where's the naming of the 12 apostles?
Mark 3:13-9.
Okay. The healing of blind Bartimaeus.
10.
Okay. What's the difference between Matthew's account and Mark's account in regards to this miracle? Bonus question, 50 points.
His name?
Huh?
His name?
No.
Just a guess.
There you go. You don't get the start. In Matthew's account, there's 2 blind men. But Mark emphasizes Bartimaeus. Jesus' calming of the sea.
6:51.
The healing of the deaf mute. What will come back again?
Mark 6:51.
6:51.
I
Okay.
can't read my writing. That's what, never mind. Yeah. I said if I could read my writing.
Or if you can read your writing.
Yeah.
Boy, I thought I was wrong on that one.
Yeah.
Okay, the healing of the deaf mute. 7:31. There's the healing of the deaf man in chapter 9. Jesus inaugurates the Lord's Supper.
14, 22, 24.
Okay, chapter 14, verses 22 and 25. Any final thoughts or questions? Thank you very much for your participation.
To be honest with